We have with us the CEO of Oxfam in India, Nisha Agrawal, and we'd like to ask a few questions regarding the new index that has come out, which basically shows how good are our top 100 companies with respect to how they treat their employees, how they treat the supply chain businesses, and other factors. What I wish to ask you is, do you think companies have willingly more transparent or are willing to disclose more now as compared to they have been a couple of years back? I mean, we just have the 2015 figures.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you, in the last 5 years or more, have they become more transparent in giving out information that?
So I think companies are slowly realizing that they have a broader role to play in society other than making profits.
Yeah.
That's a very important first step.
Yeah.
To say that you can, and people also, and society expects this. This is another important thing, that surveys of people are showing that people say, yes, companies should make a profit, but they can also do well for their employees, for their communities, for other stakeholders. So this is putting a big responsibility on them. The governments are picking up on this and setting all kinds of voluntary and involuntary guidelines. Some are laws about minimum wages, about anti-sexual harassment policies. Others at the moment were just designed as a set of voluntary guidelines. But even those in some cases are now mandated by SEBI, for example, that the top 100 companies that were listed on stock exchanges had to report against these voluntary guidelines. Now they've extended it to 500 companies. So slowly we are moving to see both a recognition from the private sector itself that they have to do more and they have to do better, and that being reflected both in the kinds of regulations and laws, etc., being passed by government and people's expectations. So the three are converging. So I think pressure is building on companies, and you're seeing, starting from a very low base, but increasing, going beyond compliance. Our whole workshop is called Going Beyond. So we are saying going beyond compliance and going beyond 2%, which we think is not really what we define as responsible business, that companies need to really adopt these guidelines and do their best to comply with them.
So even when I look at the report and the index, what I do observe is that public sector companies are more willing to disclose information, have disclosed the information, while private, a lot of factors, like especially with respect to supply chain, they haven't disclosed a lot of information. I think around 50% haven't. So how do you think we can change that?
So I think, Mr. Amitabh Kant was here in the morning. He said the way that the government is thinking about how to improve the performance of states, for example, on the doing business report, is just making that data available by state so that everybody can see. Transparency as a first step, and then they can compete with each other. Because once the data is out there to say it's easier to do business in, he gave the example of Andhra and Telangana, then business is going to rush there. And then the other states will be forced to compete. So it's a race to the top. The same thing has to be this. We are really making a first attempt at just transparency of policies, really. Do companies have policies? Are they making them public? And we hope eventually that when other people see that we are writing up and saying, for example, Birla's was mentioned several times, that they're doing really well on something, that the other companies will also be encouraged to say, oh, we would like to see our name also being highlighted as companies that are doing well. So putting in place policies as a first step, putting in place systems within the organization that disseminate those policies, that comply with those policies, and we think this whole creating this kind of an ecosystem. Ultimately, of course, it has to be even internal pressure, that kind of competitive pressure might not be enough. We have a session here this time on investors. Are investors going to take an interest in this report and say, oh, we would like to invest in companies that are doing the right thing? And then eventually in consumers, in many other countries in the West, consumers are very enlightened. They will put pressure on companies to, get their act together and really comply and do well. So it's a step-by-step process. We just started by making the companies themselves aware. And that's why it's very important for us that before we rate it in public, we send it back to them so that they can read it, they can correct it, they can own the data in this.
So the companies are as involved.
Yes, the companies are very involved. They cannot say, oh, well, we have a policy, but you didn't include it here, because we really take all the feedback into account. We want to engage with them. This is actually, the word naming and shaming is maybe not the right one, knowing and, showing, what somebody said. I think knowing and showing is what we are trying to do at the moment. But eventually, if we really see some laggards, etc., then it might have to come to naming and shaming as well.
Also, of all the factors that you took into account, whether it's non-discrimination policies or community development, supply chain, I think, is the one thing that when I talk to people as well, that people working at Praxis, Oxfam, is the one factor that keeps coming up and say that they are not, this is the area that needs more concern. Like, to make it simple, what is supply chain and how do companies, for our viewers to get a better understanding, where do companies have to strive for? What do you mean by supply chain?
So supply chain means the entire chain through which you do business.
Yeah.
This area has also been the hardest in the West.
Yeah.
So, about 20 years ago, I was working on Indonesia on labor rights, for example. So the Nike, Levi's, these companies would say, we have these very good policies because our consumers care, and they would have very good labor standards and everything. But they said, well, but we buy shoes or garments from hundreds of manufacturers. How on earth are we going to impose these policies on them? Those are separate businesses, they have nothing to do with us. So we will have very good policies, but you cannot hold us responsible for our supply chain. And consumers said, no, if you are buying from some woman who is manufacturing a shirt, how you treat her, whether you pay her well, whether you use child labor, whether you pollute the environment, all of that will matter to us. You cannot say my boundary is just my own business when all your work actually depends on a whole lot of other small businesses. So slowly, I think the West has enough pressure, as I said, came from consumers who said we are willing to pay more for goods and services where the whole supply chain is ethical, not just the whole business, right? So I think this has to come in India as well. So it is very hard because supply chain is very dispersed, it can be very fragmented. For a food processing company, they could be buying from thousands of farmers. But ultimately, you have to make that effort, because if your entire work really depends on the supply chain and the supply chain is not inclusive and ethical and well managed, then it doesn't really mean anything to say I am well managed, my company is well managed.
That's true. What do you see by the time the next report comes out? What is that one positive or negative, both, that you see? And by the time the next report comes out, any improvement, any of these factors?
So at a minimal, we would hope, that at least the laws, one should be 100% compliant. Take the anti-sexual harassment law. That's a law, that's not a voluntary guideline. That 8 companies still have not put their policy out, that's pretty shocking. So as somebody said, actually these are not voluntary guidelines. Some are laws and some are guidelines, and we need to actually separate the two and make sure there is full compliance. Maybe at the time that the nationally voluntary guidelines were written, the sexual harassment law maybe wasn't a law. But by now it's a law. It should actually, so some of those kinds of results are very surprising. The lowest score is on this, what we call free prior informed consent. So that is a very important principle when you're going to use assets that belong to poor communities. So we work, as Oxfam, we work in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Orissa. Tribal people live there, they get their livelihoods out of forests. It has been recognized under the Forest Rights Act that forest belongs to them. Now, unfortunately, the forested area plus the tribal area, which is the poorest, plus the mineral wealth in India, all in the same geography. So under these forests lie mines. Now, as Mr. Khan said, countries need to grow, countries need to develop wealth, but at what cost? At whose cost? It cannot be on the back of the poorest of the poor. The tribal people are already 20 years behind the average poor in India. So if that land belongs to them, free, prior, informed consent says that you will go, you will talk to them, you will tell them the consequences, and you will get their consent before you convert a forest into mines. Or on land acquisition, for example. These are 2 of our newest laws, the land acquisition and law and the mining law, right? The land acquisition law says the same thing. If we have to build roads, of course we have to build roads. Every country needs transport infrastructure. But if you're going to acquire land of people who live alongside that road, that might be their only source of income, wealth, livelihood, everything. You cannot just take it away. So, and especially where it's voluntary in some sense, it's not that you can just acquire land. The big difference in these laws is that we are recognizing that involuntary acquisition of assets should be a minimal, which is you need it for the development of the country, for public goods. But where it is you're going to give that wealth to another private company, a mining company, then that sharing of that wealth must go back to the communities who own it. So, these are our poorest areas. People have become so dispossessed there, you hardly see the state functioning. People have taken to armed conflict. That is not the kind of development we want to see. And so that particular score being so low is very worrying. I would think, so for next year, I would say please recognize that these assets belong to poor people. On that it would be good to see some progress, because those states are being opened up very rapidly to mining. And if we don't follow these free, prior, informed, then we're going to see even worse than what we see already in those states. And I think the laws have to be separated and there has to be 100% compliance with those.
All right. Thank you.